Some stories in history shine so brightly that they leave no room for the others. We all know the story of the Buddha, the prince who left his palace, his wealth, and his family in search of truth. But hidden behind that story is another just as powerful, just as transformative, and yet rarely told. It is the story of a woman who woke up one morning to find her life shattered, her husband gone without a word, and her place in the world suddenly uncertain. This woman was not just a silent figure in the Buddha's life. She was Yasodhara, a force of resilience and wisdom who turned heartbreak into spiritual awakening. Her journey, anchored deeply in the teachings of the Buddha, reveals that enlightenment isn't only found by leaving everything behind. It can also be discovered by facing life exactly as it is and transforming pain into power. What you're about to hear will change how you see the Buddha's story forever. It's not just about one man's path to enlightenment. It's about two equally extraordinary journeys, unfolding in completely different ways, yet meeting at the same truth. If you appreciate the stories we bring to light, the ones history tried to bury, then there's a simple, free favor I'll ask you right now. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the wisdom we share here. And whatever you do, don't skip any part of this video. Every moment of Yasodhara's journey carries a piece of wisdom that could shift the way you think about your own life. Because in the end, the Buddha's teachings remind us, suffering is a teacher, impermanence is the truth, and awakening is possible for anyone, whether you walk away from the palace gates or stay and face the storm. They say some connections are written long before we take our first breath. In the ancient Buddhist texts, Yasodhara and Siddhartha are not just two people who happened to meet. They are two souls whose paths had crossed over lifetimes. In one story from the Jataka tales, she was the devoted wife who prayed for her husband's spiritual success, even when it meant letting him go. In another, they were both seekers, walking the path to enlightenment side by side. It's as if the universe had been weaving their destinies together, preparing them for a journey that would test every bond between them. Yasodhara was no ordinary woman. Born into the Shakya clan, the same royal family as Siddhartha, she was raised in a world of privilege but also of sharp intellect and fierce independence. She could engage in political discussions, challenge philosophical ideas, and hold her own in debates with the most learned men of her time. She wasn't a silent figure sitting in the shadows of palace walls. She was a voice, a presence, someone who shaped the conversations around her. In a time when women were often seen but not heard, she commanded respect. When Siddhartha wished to marry her, it wasn't as simple as a royal decree. According to the Lalita Vistara Sutra, he had to prove himself, facing other suitors in contests of archery, sword fighting, and even intellectual challenges. It wasn't just about him winning her hand, it was about her choosing her partner. She saw in him not only skill and strength, but also a quiet depth, a mind that wandered beyond the walls of the palace, a heart that seemed to carry questions no crown could answer. Their marriage was a vision of royal perfection, gold-lined halls, gardens that bloomed in every season, 3 palaces to match the changing weather. Servants attended to every need, music filled the air, and the birth of their son Rahula seemed to seal the promise of a happily ever after. But beneath the surface, Yasodhara noticed subtle shifts. Siddhartha's late-night walks under the stars, the faraway look in his eyes, the questions he asked about suffering and death, questions that unsettled the comfort of palace life. She didn't know it yet, but the winds of impermanence, the very truth the Buddha would one day teach, had already begun to move through their lives. And Yasodhara, with her deep perception and inner strength, was about to be drawn into a story that would change the course of both their destinies. There are moments in life that feel like they rip the ground from beneath your feet. One day everything is steady, familiar, safe, and the next, It's as if the air itself has shifted. For Yasodhara, that moment came in the stillness of the night, in the comfort of her own bed. She was a wife, a mother, a princess. The palace walls had always been her shelter, the life inside them her certainty. But certainty has a way of slipping through our fingers, and the Buddha's teachings remind us that nothing, no joy, no relationship, no status, is truly permanent. The night Siddhartha left wasn't filled with argument or warning. There were no whispered goodbyes, no tearful explanations. Ancient texts tell us he lingered for a moment, looking at her and their infant son, Rahula. Some accounts say he almost woke her, others say he kissed them gently before walking away. But in the end, he chose silence. He mounted his horse, Kanthaka, with his charioteer, Channa, and rode into the darkness, leaving the palace and his old life behind. When morning came, the truth didn't arrive all at once. Yasodhara reached for her husband and felt only emptiness. She called his name, and silence answered back. The search began, through corridors, gardens, and courtyards, but every servant she questioned had the same helpless look. He was gone. Not to war, not to another kingdom, not even to another woman, gone to somewhere she could not follow. Imagine the confusion, the sting of betrayal, the weight of questions with no answers. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering, but at that moment, Yasodhara was still a woman in the grip of it. She had been left not just as a wife, but as a mother of a child who would now grow without his father. And in the society of ancient India, a woman in her position wasn't met with compassion, she was met with judgment. Whispers filled the palace halls. Rumours twisted the story. Some said he was captured. Others called him weak or unfit to rule. But no one could offer the truth she needed. Yet this is where Yasodhara's strength began to take root. She didn't collapse under the shame or hide from the stares. Instead, she lifted her chin, cradled her son, and carried the weight alone. The Buddha's path would eventually teach that suffering can be transformed into wisdom. Yasodhara was already walking that road, long before she knew it. There comes a point in life when waiting begins to feel heavier than the pain itself. Days turn into months, months into years, and the silence grows louder than any answer you could ever receive. For Yasodhara, that silence was a constant companion. Every morning she woke to the same unanswered question: where was he, and why had he left? At first there was hope, the kind of hope that keeps you scanning every face in a crowd, listening for every rumour, praying for any sign. But as the seasons passed in the grand halls of the palace, that hope began to thin, replaced by something deeper, a hunger to understand. Palace life continued around her with its endless ceremonies, the glittering gold, the feasts, the dancers, and the soft music meant to distract from the emptiness. But for Yasodhara, all of it began to feel like an elaborate performance in a play she no longer wanted to act in. She realized what the Buddha himself would one day teach, that luxury cannot protect you from suffering. It can only hide it for a while. The silks still felt soft, but they no longer warmed her. The jewels still sparkled, but they no longer shone for her. What use was all this beauty when her heart was full of questions no one could answer? It was in this space, between the loss of her old life and the birth of a new one, that something began to shift. Yasodhara found herself visiting temples not for duty or public image, but for solace. She sat in front of statues of the Buddha's past lives, listening to monks speak about impermanence, about how everything in this world changes, fades, and passes away. And while she didn't yet know the full truth of her husband's journey, she began to sense that the same questions that had driven him away were starting to awaken in her too. Then one day, a travelling monk arrived at the palace gates. He spoke of a teacher unlike any other, one who had uncovered the root of suffering, who spoke of detachment, compassion, and the way beyond craving. When he mentioned that this man had once been a prince from the Shakya clan, Yasodhara felt her entire body still. This was no stranger. This was the man she had once shared a life with. Her first reaction wasn't joy. It was a wave of emotion so strong it was almost unbearable. Relief that he was alive. Anger that he had left without a word. Confusion about what it all meant. And beneath it all, an unexpected spark of curiosity. What kind of truth was worth leaving everything and everyone you loved behind? It was in that moment Yasodhara began to understand something that lies at the heart of Buddhist wisdom. The journey toward awakening is not always chosen. Sometimes life pushes you toward it by taking away everything you thought you needed. There are moments in life when the person who left you suddenly stands before you again, and everything you thought you had processed comes rushing back like a wave. For Yasodhara, that moment came after years of silence, years of raising her son alone, years of wondering whether Siddhartha was dead or alive. Now she was hearing whispers through the palace walls. The Buddha was returning. He was no longer the restless prince she had once shared a life with. He was the enlightened one, a teacher whose name was spreading across kingdoms. The city prepared for his arrival with great excitement. Roads were cleaned, banners hung, music readied for celebration. Every member of the royal family planned to meet him at the gates, eager to welcome back the prince who had become a legend. But Yasodhara made a decision that startled everyone. She would not go. It wasn't from bitterness or pride, but from a deep sense of self-respect. She had carried the weight of his absence for too long to pretend it had never happened. If he wished to see her, he would have to come to her. When he finally did, it wasn't the man she remembered. The robes were plain, the ornaments gone, the air around him quiet and steady. His eyes were different, calmer, yet holding a depth she had never seen before. This was Siddhartha, yes, but also someone entirely new. Years of meditation, renunciation, and awakening had transformed him. And Yasodhara, too, had changed. She was no longer the sheltered princess who had once lived for palace life. Her suffering had stripped away illusions, leaving her stronger, wiser, and more grounded in truth. Buddhist teachings remind us that everything is impermanent. People, emotions, relationships. And in that meeting, both of them stood as proof. They had walked different paths. He had sought truth in forests and under the Bodhi tree. She had found it in the stillness of the palace, in the cries of a child she raised alone, in the quiet courage of facing judgment without bowing to it. Their reunion wasn't about rekindling what was lost, it was about recognizing the shared understanding they now carried. Two paths, one truth. Neither was greater, neither lesser. And in that moment, the palace walls seemed to fade, leaving only the presence of two human beings who had both, in their own way, touched enlightenment. Most people, when life breaks them, stay broken. They let the wound define them. They live inside the story of what happened to them, replaying it over and over, as if keeping the pain alive somehow gives it meaning. But Yasodhara did something astonishing. She didn't just survive being abandoned by the man who was supposed to be her partner. She used that wound as a doorway to something far greater. The Buddha taught that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Yasodhara lived this truth. She didn't let the abandonment close her heart. She let it open her eyes. When she decided to step onto the spiritual path, it wasn't about following her husband's shadow. She wasn't chasing him, she was chasing freedom. At that time, no woman had ever been allowed to join the Sangha, the monastic community. The rules were clear, spiritual life was for men. But Yasodhara had seen enough of the world to know that truth doesn't belong to one gender, one class, or one life story. In the Buddha's own words, all beings have Buddha nature, and she believed that included her. So she did what few dared to even dream of. She challenged tradition itself. With the help of Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's stepmother, and other royal women, Yasodhara made repeated requests to be ordained. The Buddha initially refused, not because he doubted her spiritual capacity, but because the structure of the Sangha simply didn't allow women. But Yasodhara and her companions refused to accept that their gender made them unworthy of awakening. So they acted. They shaved their heads, put on the yellow robes and walked to the monastery gates, not asking any more, but showing they were already ready. Imagine that moment, a group of women once wrapped in silk and jewels, now barefoot in dust, standing before the most revered teacher in the land, demanding not privilege but the right to seek liberation. Eventually, with the gentle but persistent persuasion of his cousin Ananda, the Buddha opened the Sangha to women, creating the Bhikkhuni Sangha. Yasodhara entered not as the Buddha's wife, but as a nun, a teacher and a leader in her own right. She taught that pain, abandonment and loss were not chains to carry for life. They were the fire that could burn away illusions. For her, enlightenment wasn't an escape from life, but a transformation of it. This was her revolution, and through it she proved one of the Buddha's deepest truths. The path to awakening is open to anyone brave enough to walk it. It's almost unsettling when you realize how many voices have been lost in history, not because their stories weren't worth telling, but because someone decided they didn't fit the narrative. Yasodhara is one of those voices. We remember the Buddha's journey in vivid detail, yet the woman who shared his life before enlightenment and who walked her own profound spiritual path is often reduced to a footnote. It wasn't that her story lacked meaning, far from it. It's that the systems preserving history were not built to celebrate women's wisdom. In early Buddhism, much of the tradition was passed down orally by male monastics. And as centuries went by, stories that didn't match the accepted image were either simplified or quietly erased. In Buddhist history, this pattern is sadly familiar. Women's contributions were often reframed to support the male-centered narrative. When Yasodhara is mentioned in older texts, it's usually as the wife the Buddha left behind, not as the pioneering teacher she became. This mirrors what we've seen across other religions and cultures. In Christianity, female disciples disappeared from the record. In Islamic history, many women mystics faded into obscurity. In Hindu traditions, the names of countless female sages have been forgotten. It's not that these women didn't exist, it's that their leadership disrupted the balance of power in a male-dominated spiritual world. And yet the Buddha's own teachings cut through that bias. He taught that all beings possess Buddha nature. Enlightenment is not determined by gender, wealth, or social status. It is open to anyone willing to awaken. Yasodhara lived that truth. She didn't wait for her husband to define her place in the spiritual world. She chose to walk her own path, transforming her suffering into wisdom that reached beyond her personal story. She became an example of what the Dhamma teaches, that the mind, when freed from attachment, is limitless. In recent decades, Buddhist scholars and practitioners, especially women, have been digging deeper into the Therigatha, the verses of early Buddhist nuns, and into historical records that have been overlooked. Through this work, Yasodhara's voice has begun to re-emerge. She is no longer just the abandoned wife. She is the woman who proved that enlightenment is not reserved for those who leave the world behind. It is also for those who stay, endure, and transform. Her life is a quiet revolution, reminding us that the greatest spiritual journeys are not always the ones written in the loudest ink, but the ones that continue to inspire, even after centuries of silence. Yasodhara's journey offers a powerful reminder. There is more than one way to awaken. She did not flee from her responsibilities. She transformed them. She turned the pain of abandonment into insight, the burden of judgment into strength, and the challenges of motherhood into compassion. This is what Buddhism teaches, that suffering can be the seed of wisdom, and that every person carries the potential for awakening. Yasodhara's story is not just a forgotten chapter in history, it is a living example of resilience. When life leaves you in darkness, remember her choice: to rise, to seek truth, and to become extraordinary. Thank you for walking this path with me and for being a part of Buddhist journey.